Hello. So today I'll be talking about the Ukrainian army and why it performed so much better in 2014, or in 2022 than in 2014. As highlighted in previous weeks of the course, the anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine was a massive failure. And the Ukrainian army was really disorganized, small, and ultimately unable to perform any significant operations in 2014. So I'll be looking at specifically the Ukrainian ground forces and briefly discuss other factors that influence this. Basically, seeing how the Ukrainian army reformed itself to prove a successful fighting force in 2022. So I'll be looking at this through three main ideas. The first is material and resources. There's this wonderful resource that I found called the White Book. It's published by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and is publicly available. So I looked at some numbers from there. You can just look at the defense budget here. You see in 2013, the budget is only about 15 million. And in 2021, it was 120 million. There was high inflation during this time. So if you take that into account, it's only about fourfold increased, but that's still a big jump in spending, allowing them to better fund their armed forces. And Ukraine's defense budget was, if you look at how that money was actually spent, it was disproportionately committed to maintenance rather than growing the force through training and procurement. And if you compare that to other countries like the US, they spend 35% of their military budgets purely on research and development and procurement. And if you compare that to Canada, and assume about half the operations is spent on training, they're also spending 30% of their budget on procurement and training and equipment. And you compare that to Ukraine, who doesn't even hit 20%. Sometimes it's closer to 10%. So 32. So if we compare this to the numbers in 2021, right before the war, you can see that just equipment and infrastructure take up 32% of the budget. So you can see that proportionately, they're spending a lot more on expanding their military than they were in 2013. As well, they're receiving large amounts of equipment from Western allies by this time, although not at the high levels compared to what they are receiving right now. And something I want to briefly mention, but I won't have time to go into, is this Ukrainian defense industry. This is basically like the big conglomerate in Ukraine that produces the weapons domestically. Um, I won't have time to discuss it, but it was merged in 2010 from a bunch of small companies, and it has quite a bit of corruption issues, and uh, actually tries to focus on making money off of exports than making better weapons for Ukraine. But yeah, and another key thing with material is logistics, because it doesn't matter how much weapons you have if you can't use them effectively. And one thing that Ukraine reformed is they adopted this new Prozoro system for distribution of supplies in 2014. So prior to the Donbass war, procurement occurred via written requests. So this allowed for more corruption and other issues like that. And the Prozoro system was like an open, uh, basically list of requests from government and military officials for things like food and clothing. That was public, and companies could compete for contracts, which is a much better way at preventing corruption and having better pricing for the military. So just referring to somebody who talks about logistics, this scholar, Thomas Dressel Young, professor at the Naval Graduate School and an expert in defense of Europe and the United States, he basically argues that communist logistics are inferior to Western methods, and that for countries with these legacy logistic systems to have a successful logistical system, they need to adopt Western methods, specifically NATO guidelines. And this is actually something that the Ukrainian White Book that I discussed earlier talks about, focusing on not only NATO guidelines in terms of logistics, but mentioning it specifically. And I could talk a lot about the failures of Russian logistics, but basically, uh, their logistics system was worse off than Ukraine, and they were on the offensive in the war, which puts more strain on their system than would be on the defense if for Ukraine. So that put further strain on them and was an important factor in success. So investment logistics reform in Investment in and logistics reform in and the expansion of the Ukrainian armed forces since 2014 provided with strong capabilities to counter the Russian invasion in 2022. So now moving on to leadership and strategy. The scholar who talks about this is Tom Dyson and Yuri Pashchuk. Dyson is a military learning expert from the University of London, and Yuri Pashchuk is a former Ukrainian army colonel from the Ukrainian National Army and is currently a specialist at the Ukrainian National Army Academy. The first thing they kind of talk about is different styles of leadership based on age and training. So, like different generations in the Ukrainian army based on how long they've been there and what they grew up with. So, like people from the Soviet era, people who've been there for many, many decades, kind of are committed to those old systems and are less wishing to have reforms happening. And people who have been in the Donbass war since 2014 are more willing and wanting to commit to reforms. They argue that these people are going to be really important for reforming the military. And then as well, they just, since Dyson's a military learning expert, discusses some of the ways that Ukraine has adopted those systems, basically to document battlefield experience so other members can learn from it. And I was just talking about corruption in the army. It's quite important, but progress has been made since 2014, even though it's not solved. There's still civilian oversight over the military via the Ministry of Defense, who's appointed by the president of Ukraine. But there's not really any control by parliament, which is a downside, and it's still not fully transparent, but things have improved since 2014. Somebody who talks about corruption and reform is Glenn Grant, a UK defense analyst, basically arguing that Soviet culture and corruption still dominates in Ukraine, and that officers within Ukraine are actually unwilling to fight the system because of risks to their career, and that the changes and reforms that have occurred are largely thanks to NATO pushes. Now, he was actually rebutted by Zrodnyuk and other scholars who wrote an article saying he was just being really pessimistic and negative about the Ukrainian forces and their commitment to fight corruption. He argued that significant progress had been made and the commitment by Ukrainians was legitimate. Another pair of scholars who talk about corruption and reform are Bookville and Sullivan. Bookville is a Russia-Ukraine politics expert, historian from Norway, and Sullivan at this time was a PhD student at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. They argue or display a variety of factors that influence internal resistance to reforms within different organizations. If you remember that defense conglomerate I mentioned before, that's one of the organizations they discuss. They don't discuss the military or the ground forces specifically, but the things they discuss can kind of be applied to that in certain ways, mentioning just internal corruption causing issues in organizational traditions, that sort of thing. But basically characterize reforms in the Ukrainian military as slow and incomplete, but having some progress. As well, one way that leadership was different between 2014 and 2022 is that Ukraine started emphasizing these non-commissioned officers. And these are basically the people, if you're on the front line, these are the people who you interact with the most. And Russia, interestingly, lacks these people quite a bit in their hierarchy. So these officers are really important in Western ideas. So the West really strongly believes that these are really important for having a successful military. And a scholar who kind of talks about this is Liam Collins, founder and director of Modern War Institute, a former U.S. colonel. He argues, first of all, that the reforms that have happened in Ukraine have been essential to their current success. But in terms of junior leaders, he talks about disciplined initiatives, basically these non-commissioned officers that I just talked about being allowed to make their own decisions in the battlefield and on the front if the situation changes. This kind of contrasts Russia, where the planning and orders are very centralized. The people in the middle really don't have a say. It's only the people at the top, where the system that Ukraine has allows those junior officers and leaders to make more decisions independently. And then finally, just talking about the leadership of Ukraine. In 2014, they had an interim government. They just had a revolution. So the government was a lot less stable than it was in 2022 with the Zelensky government and administration well established. Now, just talking about general strategy, Ukraine was not prepared for the separatist uprisings in 2013 or 14. In fact, their entire army was positioned out in the west of the country, and the uprisings took place in the east. Contrast that to the 2022 invasion. Ever since Petro Poroshenko's presidency, they'd been preparing for Russia to expand the war in the Donbass to the rest of the country. So, while they may have not been fully mobilized, they had contingencies ready. And then quickly mentioning the Russian strategy was basically very flawed, overzealous, thinking they could bypass cities and take Kyiv, and the rest of the country would collapse rather quickly or provide little resistance. But these mistakes made them even more vulnerable logistically. They're susceptible to strikes and counterattacks and things. It was just a very very big miscalculation and underestimation of the Ukrainian forces. And finally, just talking about strategy, a big advantage that the Ukrainians had is that U.S. intelligence was shared to them, allowing them to make better tactical and strategic decisions. And this is something news articles talk about a lot and help them sink the ship I have pictured here. So Ukraine's partial reforms against corruption in Soviet systems during the Donbass War in preparation for Russian invasion, which was poorly planned, were key to their success in 2022. And finally, we're going to talk about personnel and manpower. In 2014, the Ukrainian army had actually just gone through some cuts. At the end of 2013, there was 121,000 active service personnel, but this was actually down 14,000 service personnel from the year prior. And most scholars kind of agree that only like 6,000 or 7,000 of these military personnel were battle ready at the start of the Donbass War. And this was largely due to a planning decision made since 2006 to create this small mobile army. But because they didn't sufficiently fund it, they ended up with just an army of the same caliber, just smaller. So they really got nothing out of it except a smaller, still mediocre at best military. This talked by Sanders, who we'll be discussing soon. So this lack of manpower was filled by volunteer battalions. And they were really essential for defending or maintaining the front in the early part of the Donbass War. Now, if we just quickly compare those 2014 numbers and the situation to what there is in 2022, 2021, you can see there's 195,000 active military personnel. Conscription had been reintroduced, and initiatives to recruit more people to the army were well underway by the armed forces. And if you look at the reservist chart on the right, you can see that 234,000 reservists were in the army in 2021, and that had been increasing steadily since 2017. So a scholar who kind of talks about manpower in the 2006 plan is Deborah Sanders, a defense studies expert and military historian at the King's College London. She basically argues that this 2006 plan failed to predict the static war that would break out in the Donbass, and that the aim to build a small professional military force or armed forces was misguided and made them susceptible to the static war, which they were also unprepared for in terms of their equipment stockpiles. Another scholar who talks about the volunteer battalions is Ilmar Kaika, a Finnish veteran, now war studies professor at the Swedish Defense University. He argues that, as I said before, that the volunteer battalions were essential in the early part of the war, but they became a liability due to lacking power structures. You can really direct them very well. They might commit war crimes, that sort of thing. And Sanders also made similar comments about the volunteer battalions. Now, the way the volunteer battalions were dealt with and integrated is that they're kind of integrated into military forces. So they became their own battalions that were under direct command of the military leadership. And this allowed for better coordination and allocation of resources and made sure that they followed NATO guidelines. And they also made the Territorial Defense Force, which you can see the emblem I have in the middle of the slide. These didn't play a huge role in 2022, but served as an outlet for people to volunteer and get actively involved. Now, quickly mentioning experience, if an army's been fighting for 8-7 years, it's obviously going to be better than an army that hasn't done that. So we'll just leave that at that. Obviously, experience helps. Then talking about training, Western countries since 2014 have been providing military training to Ukraine. So this included Canada via Operation Unifier, the UK via Operation Orbital, the United States have been providing training. This really enhanced the military capabilities of Ukraine. As well, if we look at morale, Ukraine had made several reforms to try to increase it, including offering more diverse food selections to their troops, better housing, better medical care, and increased pay. Although interestingly, the pay rate was actually still lower than Russian pay and much lower than European pay to their soldiers. And as well, the morale in 2014 was less clear. The motivation to fight was less clear than in 2022. This was partially due to the political instability that had just occurred and largely also due to the disinformation campaign by Russia. They had news networks and social media that were much more penetrating in 2014 and then in 2022 under Petro Poroshenko and then further under Zelensky. Bans of media took place and they were better able to control disinformation, although sometimes this came at the price of freedom of speech. So Ukraine's expanded experience and reliable personnel allowed them to quickly confront enemy divisions and stabilize the front. So just looking at some scholarly debates, the main one is kind of, can the army complete reforms and meet NATO guidelines? And the argument about this is just based on corruption and the willingness and reliability of Ukrainian reform. If you remember Glenn Grant, he argued that the Soviet culture is so entrenched and that corruption is still really dominant and the reforms are minimal. While there's like Zrodniak, we're asserting that reforms are progressing and Ukrainians are motivated to complete them. And more people kind of take Zrodniak's side or like something similar to there, maybe a little softer, but still that progress is being made and there's legitimate commitment. But problems still persist. But just generally, the key in this argument is that fighting corruption is really key in the army or in the armed forces to keep other reforms progressing and to keep the commitment to reform strong. So Ukraine's expansion of ground forces, partially successful reforms, and experience during the war in the Donbass gave the army the ability to resist Russia's offensive in 2022. Specifically, reforms in logistics, corruption, and military leadership were important, as well as increased investment, foreign support, experience, and confidence in the government. Russia's unrealistic expectations gave further advantage to Ukraine. The partially reformed, enlarged, and experienced military allowed Ukraine to effectively counter the poorly prepared Russian offensive.